Welcome everyone to lovely Ottawa. Thank you for joining us for Simplify Your Purchasing and Navigate Policy Changes with Smart Supplier Solutions. My name is Amit Darvish. I am the Vendor and Membership Management Advisor at ONPHA. This year, we're excited to bring the ONPHA Opening Doors Podcast experience live to our conference. Some of you might remember our very first episode at last year's trade show. Since then, we've produced several more episodes covering key topics, from using data to tackle housing challenges to strategies for growth through acquisitions and more. The goal of our podcast is to highlight the incredible achievements within our sector and share actionable insights for housing providers adapting to the changing world. We hope you enjoy this unique experience, and I'm going to hand it off to David.
Thanks, Amit, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us in the room and online today. Again, I'm David Rourke. I'm the one of the co-founders of Roundtable Procurement Services. We're a company that my business partner and I founded 20 years ago. We both were with Deloitte Consulting and their supply chain practice, but wanted to work specifically and focus just on the nonprofit sector in Canada. So we started Roundtable. We work with organizations of all size, the largest in the country as well as many of the smallest. So really, at any nonprofit in Canada, where we support with good purchasing practices. And we're a proud partner of ONPHA's in managing the ONPHA Enterprise Program, which you may or may not have heard of. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so for today, you may have seen in the write-up, and maybe one of the reasons you're here is we will talk about some of the policy changes and the evolving requirements and regulatory environment around nonprofit procurement. One of the reasons we wanted to have this session is because there has been a lot of interest in that topic over the last 12, 18 months coming into ONPHA. So we said, okay, let's make sure we focus on that. So there'll be some discussion specifically about some of the policy changes that have come out in Ontario and even nationally in the last 18 months. But we won't just stop there. We know there are more pressures on your spending environment, your procurement practices than just policy and government regulations. So we'll talk about some of those as well. And then we better not let you out of here without talking about some tips and solutions and some advice on how you can manage through some of that changing landscape. One of the strategies we'll expand on is I'll call it a vendor of record approach or a preferred vendor approach, or the idea of partnerships. And I think that aligns well with the values of the sector in building partnerships, the theme of the conference in building bridges. And I think we can make a case that having good supplier partnerships and preferred vendor or vendor of record approach can help a lot when you're dealing with some of these challenges out there right now. Okay, for those in the room, I just need a sense before I decide how to focus our time. Just the mix in the room. Unfortunately, I can't, of course, see who's watching online, but any government staff here? Okay, just have to watch what I say. Anyone that receives over 10 million a year in funding? Okay. I'm assuming there may be a couple more online. Anyone subject to the broader public service or public sector procurement directive? Okay, fair enough. That's why you're here. And then, of course, none of the above? Yeah, everyone else. Okay. All right, I noticed some people.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of hands go up, David.
So if you didn't raise your hand, it doesn't mean you should leave. Please don't. Although if you do, that's okay. Just make sure it's for other reasons. I just wanted to get a sense before we talk about some of the specific policies and regulatory changes, just the mix of the audience here. I won't dive too much into the details. Perhaps if you're subject to the BPS directive, we can talk more in detail later if you like, but we'll discuss some of the requirements there. But it's not necessary to be subject to any of the policies I'm about to talk to you about, because for a number of reasons. One, they can change, and they have been changing, and new requirements emerge all the time. So just because you're not subject to any of the current regulations doesn't mean you won't in the future. either the same as thresholds change and scope changes, which again is happening, or as new requirements emerge, which again we saw 2 new policies come out this past year that affect the sector. So please stay and please listen, even if some of this won't apply to you right now. There's also, I know you have your own local requirements, perhaps your own local funder, your own policy. So everyone has rules, right? Dylan said you got to serve somebody. So we all have rules that we need to follow, whether they're formal coming from the government or they're internally driven. And finally, and this is where I can be a little bit complimentary to our government friends. The directives, the regulations that have come down are actually quite good, and they drive good practice. And in fact, I'm in favor of them. So I encourage you, even if some of these don't apply to you, to try to make it a goal to comply with them. All right, let's get into it. So the first one I'll discuss is just quickly the BPS directive. This one's been around for a while now. You may have heard about it. Again, even if it doesn't directly apply to you. But this one was launched in 2011 for the broader public sector. I was fortunate enough to be an advisor to the Ministry of Finance as they launched this. That's partially why I feel pretty good about it, because I do think it provides a nice balance between good practice to follow, as well as being realistic, let's face it, for the nonprofit sector and the nonprofit housing environment. And we'll get a little into that a little more down the road. As you can see on the screen, the magic number really is $121,200. Don't ask me why they added the $1,200 to the end of that. But it prior to this year, that the magic threshold was $100,000. They raised it, I'm sure, as they realized it doesn't take much these days to spend $100,000. So there are a number of requirements, many mandatory requirements in this directive. Again, they're good practices, and I encourage you, if you're looking for some light reading, to go through some of it, and I'm happy to talk about it anytime. But really, the primary threshold to remember, if you want to follow this directive, is the $121,000, because anything over that number, any purchase you make, any contract value that is over that number, needs to be put to public tender, public RFP. So it's and there are very clear steps to follow in that RFP process if it's over 121. Below 121, and there's a chart up there, and if I see people taking their photos, I'm assuming the materials will be made available after, but part of why I want to put these charts in, so you have that resource for you after the session to just refer back. As you may be able to see, the other thresholds are recommended, but the one that is mandatory is the 121,000. You'll also notice that consulting services, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, is centered out. There is a focus on consulting services that are treated a little differently. And I think the rationale behind that was because that was the primary area of abuse in the past, where organizations were hiring consultants and no one was really sure what they were doing. So I think the government said, okay, if you're gonna be labeling somebody as a consultant, you have to follow some very specific rules.
Is there a scope of like what those consultants do that covered there?
Yeah, and in fact, I've got that in the tips later. But the bottom line is, be careful what you label as consulting versus maybe some other professional services. We tend to throw the word consultant around. I encourage you to pull back a little bit on your use of consultant, so that you don't fall under the specific rules that apply to consulting. Okay, and if you're under 10 million, by the way, you're not forgotten in the directive. They provide guidelines. So the broader public service or public sector procurement guidelines apply. It's all recommended. So the reason why I'm not focusing on that today is that they're not mandatory. You don't need to worry about whether you're compliant. But as I said, who knows when that threshold drops? Who knows when the mandatory versus optional changes in the future? So I would say make sure it's on your radar. But there is a document that is available to provide guidelines if you're under 10 million a year in funding. The other legislation that came out this year that you may have heard of was the BOBI, Building Ontario Businesses Initiative. This was launched this year, brand new. So while the BPS directive has been around for a long time, this one is just fresh, new. You can see some of the thresholds up there. Again, this was rolled into the BPS directive, so it is mandatory to follow the BOBI guidelines if you're in that 10 million a year above or not. It's optional if you're below. So again, keep that in mind. But you can again see the $121,000 mark there. The directive or the regulation says if you're buying something below 121, give businesses in Ontario preference wherever possible. If you're above 121, below 366, which is an international threshold, you're asked to give Canadian businesses preference. And then over 366,000, very odd numbers, by the way, but I won't go into that one. They're not very round numbers. Then there are specific strategies you're supposed to take when you go to market around the selection criteria you use to make sure that you're giving preference to Canadian or Ontario businesses. And then over 50 million is a whole other set of requirements. So those, again, are the thresholds if you're making purchases and you're subject to that broader public sector directive, as most in the room at least are not. I won't spend a whole lot more time on that, but again, any of these I'm happy to talk more about. I think I even have a copy of this act over at our table. So if you want to talk more about this, happy to do so. And I'm intentionally not going into a lot of detail of any of these because, let's face it, it's policy. And if it doesn't directly apply to you today, we don't want to talk more about it than we absolutely need to. But we should be aware. What goes hand in hand with this directive and the BOBI requirements is the fact that now there is reporting requirements. And you could say, well, they always existed, sort of. Now they're mandatory in the directive. And really what that just means is while it was self-policing before, following any of these regulations, now nonprofit organizations are being asked to submit a report of all the spending, with a focus on above 100, previously 100,000, now 120,000, where you basically have to provide a report of your large contracts back to the province. There are some optional fields, but there are mandatory fields in that report, including contract details, the dates when they start, when they expire, the value, of course, but also how the supplier was selected, what the method of selection was, whether it was a public tender, whether it was 3 quotes, whether it was invitational RFP. And they're, as of this year, again, they're asking that you confirm that you've been compliant with the BOBI requirements that I had on the last page. So this procurement activity report, it's unclear how long it's been around because some agencies were making some funders were making their agencies report this out for many years. It really hit the mass radar, I think. I want to say we did 3 years worth of data in 2021, and then 2022, and then 2023. And then this year we've been asked to report twice, which is just, so it's really hard to pin down the timing. It looks like they might settle on deadlines around the end of summer, early fall every year to report on the previous fiscal year. So it's still emerging. It's run by Supply Chain Ontario. They say that the primary focus is to provide data to the feds for international trade agreement negotiations. But let's face it, when they're asking about the method of selection and compliance with BOBI requirements, they're also checking in to make sure people are following the rules. So
what happens if you don't file it?
Well, there's the risk is that you lose funding ultimately. So far, I haven't seen that happen. There's several slaps on the wrist.
Yeah.
There's lots of warnings, and I think it's new. And I've been on a number of webinars. I don't know if anyone else went on some of these webinars around this report because there were many, and there was a lot of panic, especially the first couple of reports they were asked. I see some nodding of heads where Yeah. We were originally given no time to put this together, and then the instructions were unclear. And so I think there's been some flexibility, Hamid, but I wouldn't expect that to continue. I think
It's going to be something you hire a consultant for.
well, you can. It's unfortunate if you need to. And I'll get to some tips on reporting, whether it's for the PAR or otherwise a little bit later.
Think your current suppliers are giving you the best deal? It's time to put that to the test. As a nonprofit housing provider, making every dollar work harder is essential. With ONPHA Enterprise, your group purchasing program, you can unlock significant savings on phones, office supplies, maintenance services, and more. Try our new invoice value check today. Simply submit a sample of your invoices to onpha.purchasing at rtps.ca by January 31st, and our trusted partners at Roundtable Procurement Services will send you back a snapshot of how much more value you could unlock using ONPHA Enterprise. Plus, by participating, you could win an iPad. Don't wait. Start saving and enter to win today.
Anyone submit a procurement activity report in the past? One of these PARs in the room? No.
Actually, before there's a good question that came up. It says, can you define what is meant by Canadian businesses for procurement? And then does this mean a company registered to operate in Canada with X amount of employees with citizenship?
Yeah. The definition of both an Ontario business and a Canadian business are in the BOBI legislation. So we'd have to look that up. But essentially, for Ontario, I know it's 200 or 250 employees in Canada with a head office base. In Ontario, head office based in Ontario. I believe the definition for Canadian business are similar.
Yeah.
You have to have obviously a Canadian address registered to operate business in Canada. And again, this will go to one of my comments later, not to scare anybody, that they do soften the language to say just give preference whenever possible.
Does the OECM and their buying groups have a benefit to social housing providers versus doing formal RFPs?
Okay. Yeah. So I could talk about other vendor of record and preferred vendor and buying groups a little bit later. OECM was developed for the education sector, and they can help any nonprofit. Any other buying group will have solutions that were developed compliant with all of these, I'm sure. I can't speak to every, but I know OECM and some of the other larger ones would. Then you just have to watch that the needs that they were developed for are helpful for you. So they weren't developed for the housing. So to say whether they have benefit, I guess it depends on the category and the supplier deal. And so you just have to be careful, watch, make sure it fits for what you need. But it's not as clear cut as if you go to market yourself and run your own RP, then you're getting exactly what you need for your operation. Okay, anyone here fit any of these criteria? Over 20 million in assets, 40 million in revenue, 250 employees. Yeah, okay. And if you sell anything, which may be less likely, but do you buy anything from outside of Canada? Whether you may have used the services of a broker, it may be as simple as using UPS or even Amazon, frankly. But if you're importing any goods from outside of Canada, then the next one may or may not apply to you. Okay, Bill S2E1. Anyone familiar with that one? This one is a federal bill that was launched again this year. It requires all organizations in Canada that fit the previous description to report on actions that you take to make sure there are no unethical practices in your supply chain. So while that sounds broad and vague, it is. And as it says up there, it's very subject to interpretation. And there was a lot of scrambling going on earlier this year as it went into effect January 1st, but with first reporting deadline May 31st. And lawyers and consultants were busy trying to interpret and figure out and and decide how it applies, especially in the nonprofit sector. But there's nothing in the bill that excludes the nonprofit organization. So just by being a nonprofit doesn't make you exempt from this. What really comes down to is, okay, am I really importing anything? If I'm buying the occasional widget from outside of Canada, do I really? And ultimately, and to be honest, this went to many boards to interpret this, because the liability goes directly to the board members with significant fines if you don't comply with this bill. It's actually got quite a lot of teeth if they decide to want to enforce this, and that's why this interpretation of how it applies is really a challenge, and I think has to be clarified in future years. But what ultimately happened was organizations went on the safe side and said, okay, I'll put there's an online questionnaire to fill out. There, you post your report publicly on your website. Yeah, so a lot of the nonprofits we work with went ahead and just did this just to make sure. And again, not a bad idea. Let's face it. This is all a principle we support. It's something that is no one's going to oppose to the underlying motivation here. It's just whether any of you need another report to fill out, exit project in your life. If this doesn't apply to you, I get it. So, something that, again, happy to chat more about for anyone who's not sure if this applies. I can't promise you I'll give you a clear answer, because as I said, it did come down to the interpretation of a lot of individual boards. There's one tied to this, and again, if you use a broker, you may have seen this already, but there was another change in how customs and duties were handled. If you're bringing things in, you now have to set up an account with through the CARM portal. I don't remember, but Canadian Border Services have set up an online portal where you've got to manage your own imports. No longer can a broker front the customs and duty for you. You've got to put a cash bond up that will pay for any duties for things coming in. I didn't put it up here because I have the assumption it doesn't apply to a wide range of our audience, but it may apply to some of you. And again, if you haven't heard of it, let's talk, and you should be aware. Fun stuff so far, right? Yeah. Procurement's not always this this imposing, but I think really one of the messages here is that
the government's getting more involved.
Yeah, governments care.
Yeah,
right. Governments care. So there's more and more oversight we see emerge. Starting in 2011, and there was a piece of that before that. And I'm sure in your own individual operations, you have plenty of involvement from your local municipalities, your local governments. But this is happening on a larger scale now. The scope is getting bigger. And it's just clear that, procurement is an area of concern or focus, or at least interest for our regulatory bodies out there. And again, I want to emphasize, just because some of these don't apply to you today doesn't mean they won't tomorrow, or there may be others that, two came out last year, this bill S2E1 and BOBI. Who knows what we'll see in 2025 and beyond. So just know that this might be something that you wake up to one day with a memo from your funding ministry with a new requirement. But again, I'll emphasize, I don't really oppose any of them. They're all good ideas, even if they don't apply to you. The principles behind them, the degree to which you follow them, they're just good practice. And I'm not saying best practice, because I think best depends on your situation. And I'm not saying they're overbearing. I think most of what we're talking about today, perfectly manageable and frankly, a good idea. Talked about that. I mentioned already, we've got a lot of pressures beyond the government. And I think I saw some nodding of heads with thinking about local pressures and your own board. We've seen auditors get really interested in this stuff, where they'll make procurement practices a focus of an audit every once in a while. and they'll dive into that. The cynical of you will say they're trying to sell you some consulting services, but I have faith in your auditors. That's not true. But the reality is, this comes up in different arenas, and sometimes it's just because someone on your board has a background in this and flags, hey, what's our procurement policy look like? Sometimes it's you're applying for a grant, and one of the requirements in the grant is please provide your procurement policy, or please tell us about your purchasing practices. So we see this kind of pressure all the time, and even with the government involvement aside, the sort of outside influences are telling us this is an area of interest. I'll even say, obviously public, if we're trying to fundraise, this is something people are very concerned about. Where's our donations going? I've seen it become more of a concern with staff. And as we think about how hard it is to retain staff, we see staff concerned about how we spend our money, both in terms of getting good value, but also what kind of organizations we're buying from. Where does the environment fit in, for example? Where does supplier diversity fit in? So, staff are taking an interest in the underlying values of the organizations they work for. So I think having good procurement practices can help with a message to your staff as well. Sorry, just have to keep making sure I'm hitting all our points. Ultimately, the fiscal responsibility is underlying everything. Okay, lots of spotlights, lots of pressures. I got to say, I mean, I see some, and I can't tell if the looks are concern or stress or people are listening to their playlist. I do want to back off on some of the doom and gloom if it's felt like any of that. I think I've enjoyed working in the sector for 20 years, and we've been fairly successful because I really believe in the balance of what we're talking about and back to the realities of what you have to get done on a day-to-day basis. Your teams have a lot more to worry about than good procurement practice. We heard a lot about that in the plenary this morning. Of course, there's lots happening in the sector. I never once want to suggest or even believe that any of this should override getting the support that people need, both the clients you're supporting and as well as your staff. So I want to make sure that we're very clear on that. We've got to have our priorities. Expensive delivering on mission may be a bit dramatic, but I think we can. I've seen a lot of overcorrection because this is a sector of green followers. I think people want to do the right thing, and so when you hear about some of these requirements out there, you tend to want to make sure that we're driving towards following the rules. The reality is there's flexibility within the rules. There's some gray area. I've already talked about some vagueness in some of these acts, and you've got to do what's right for your organization.
But do you want vendors to be competing with each other during that process, like trying to get the best option or the best price putting out?
Well, that's one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later when I talk about this sort of the vendor of record idea, because that's often offset by got to get 3 quotes for everything, right? And I'll talk about how, frankly, getting 3 quotes sometimes is dumb. It's a dumb strategy. It really doesn't make any sense. And so that's a good example of overcorrection where we think, okay, good procurement, I've got to get 3 quotes for everything. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, if you have good partnerships that are well established based on a solid foundation, you should be reducing how often you need to get a bunch of quotes. I'll also use it. I've seen people who are pulling RFP templates off the internet or from their public sector experience where they're 60 pages long and they start with 3 pages of definitions. And let's face it, that's not what we need. And it's not a document that reflects, in my opinion, the values of the sector or getting a good message across in a good RFP document. Contracts should be good contracts, but we have to watch the legalese and we have to be careful about just about how much we're going overboard on some of this stuff. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but be very clear. The priority is get your work done, get people the support they need first.
Think your current suppliers are giving you the best deal? It's time to put that to the test. As a nonprofit housing provider, making every dollar work harder is essential. With ONPHA Enterprise, your group purchasing program, you can unlock significant savings on phones, office supplies, maintenance services, and more. Try our new invoice value check today. Simply submit a sample of your invoices to onpha.purchasing at rtps.ca by January 31st, and our trusted partners at Roundtable Procurement Services will send you back a snapshot of how much more value you could unlock using ONPHA Enterprise. Plus, by participating, you could win an iPad. Don't wait. Start saving and enter to win today.
To help with that, let's talk about a few tips. If you don't already, I would suggest using purchase orders and written contracts wherever you can. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. It makes it very clear for you and for the supplier what you expect and what the terms are. It also, if you do ever have to report, whether it's for something like that PAR I talked about, or again, a funder wants has a question about your spending, or you've got a grant application to fill out. It's just a great source of information for you to have a database or a file drawer full of actual contracts or purchase orders that document the transactions you've got with your supplier. So that's right at the top of the list. Use a system if you can. Again, depending on how large you are, but a software is great, whether it's part of your financial management package or a standalone. There are lots of inexpensive contract management software out there. So if that's possible, great. And again, it's searchable. You can call up key dates, for example. You can keep track of, so you're not surprised when a cleaning contract is coming due, or a snow removal contract, or an HVAC. All those things that suddenly it's auto renewed and you've forgotten about it. So, I would say keep good paperwork and keep it managed if you can. As I said, careful with the term consulting. Whether the act we talked about applies to you or not, it may in the future. And let's face it, some of the professional services you procure is not consulting. So I've seen architects referred to as consultants before, design engineers, any of these professional services where there's a very tangible deliverable at the end of the day. You can not call them consulting. The definition of consulting they're using in the BPS documents is more around pure advisory services without any clear, tangible deliverable at the end. And you're not, it's clearly not a professional service. It's just an advisor. So,
would there be any negative implications if, like, let's say you determine that you hired a consultant, but you don't want to label it as that?
I'm not saying don't label a consultant.
Yeah.
I'm just saying don't label non-consultants as consultants. So, be upfront and honest about everything, but don't overuse the word consultant if, in fact, what you're hiring is more of a professional service that would fit a different description. Because, again, it's been an area of abuse in the past, and it is an area of focus, I'm sure, moving forward. So just be careful. And that can go to even how your general ledger is set up. Because a lot of the time, the data we're using to report on any of this is coming from our accounts payable data. It's coming from our general ledger. So if something is in as consulting and it's really not, or when you code something and it's coded as a consultant, it really isn't, just be careful. So just a word of warning there. I have up there use domestic suppliers. I feel like we do it naturally anyway, and it's not just this sector, but I don't see a lot of international sourcing, and we're not overseas sourcing other suppliers. There are definitely some exceptions, like textiles, for example. And if you ever buy linens and towels or t-shirts for an event or anything, I think I think Cambridge Towel was the last domestic Canadian-based supplier of textiles, and I think they're gone. So there are some things where there's just no option, but clearly with some of the emphasis on cross-border importing as well as ethical supply chains, we have a lot more visibility if we're working with suppliers who are a little more local. And frankly, I think it fits some of the value sets we have as well. Of course, that's one of many criteria you need to think about when you're searching for a supplier. You're not going to buy local at any expense, of course, but it sure helps if they have their headquarters registered in Canada or at least significant operations in Canada. As well as contracts and PO, I really recommend you have documented policies, procedures specifically for procurement, not just sort of as a paragraph in your finance policy. And again, it may be because you'll get to a point of the grant application that you're being asked to provide something and you have to scramble to put it together, or it is subject to an auditor review or a board review. Even if it's a couple of pages, having something that outlines the principles that you want your staff to use when making purchases, large and small. Having something written is better than kind of going by the seat of your pants, because ultimately what then you're asking your staff to do is use their own judgment and their own principles, which can go in any direction. I think having some clear guidance for staff and how purchases should be made is always a good idea, and having them written allows you to hand them over if you need to.
Have you ever worked with organizations where they've had difficulty like enforcing that policy or procedure at say day-to-day transactions?
Where they have had difficulty or have not had, because yes, everyone has difficulty. We all have difficulty with I'm sure implementing all of our policy and procedures. There's whether it's because of staff turnover or just because people forget or it just doesn't suit the moment, or perhaps we have bad policies and procedures. But yeah, there's always challenges getting staff alignment, and that's why good development of new policy will of course involve staff and get their input. So you're really trying to make sure it covers your needs. But yeah, change management is a big part of everything we're talking about today. People are very used to running down to the dollar store, running out to Canadian Tire, buying online. So it is a challenge, because if you don't support that strategy, if there's nothing in place to tell them not to do it, then there's really nothing to enforce. But I've got whole sessions on some of the challenges of buying from retail and how that's perhaps not your best value for money, but I won't go into a lot of detail on that today.
But one question, I think that's related to what we're talking about here. It says, would having a bylaw in your governance suffice?
Well, however, I think that's even more enforceable for sure. So would it suffice? Probably. It just depends on how well you can enforce it, police it.
Yeah. And
based on what we just talked about, if you're out of compliance with your bylaw on a regular basis, that sounds like a bigger problem. I think it depends on the stage of your procurement maturity, shall we say. If you're ready for that, great. If you're not, though, start simple, build some guidelines, build some good practices, give people some tools that help them follow the steps you want them to follow to make sure you're compliant. The overall tip is put this on your agenda. I know everyone has a lot to do, but the fact that you're sitting here or listening is a good sign that this is all right. I probably need to talk to the people who are walking around that they're not thinking about procurement. I appreciate you being here, because it is something worth not letting slip through the cracks, is really the biggest piece of advice I can give you. But I think the most overarching strategy, and one of the things that can cover off many of the issues, is having a preferred vendor approach, or some you may refer to as a vendor of record strategy. And so that's what I want to talk about specifically next. Okay. So why preferred vendors? And I guess it goes back to your question, Hamid, about don't we want a 3-quote and have competition all the time? Because that is, frankly, it's the biggest opposition I hear to having a small number of close supplier partnerships as well. They get comfortable. We don't get that competitive edge of getting quotes all the time, and it is something you need to manage. But I can tell you, it just makes your life a whole lot easier in the long run. It's a little bit of work up front, which I'll talk about, but if you have instead of you look at your accounts payable and it's just pages and pages of suppliers, you're saying, what are we buying from these guys? If you have great visibility and a tight list of suppliers where you're at 80% or more of your spending, it just makes a lot of these things a lot easier. Reporting, for sure. You have fewer conversations to have. If you don't have good data internally, the next best source is your suppliers. So reporting from your suppliers on how much you spent, what you've purchased, that's all a lot easier to do if you have few rather than many. The risk around having different contracts out there or not having contracts. And, so if you have multiple sites and you have multiple snow removal companies, you're dealing with that risk with each one rather than having that conversation once about your standards. Likewise with your cleaning. If you've got multiple properties and you've got multiple cleaners, I understand sometimes it's necessary, neighborhoods and geography. But boy, if you can drive standards with one cleaning company with multiple crews, it just, again, management life is just so much easier. You also have the ability to have leverage in a different way. So we think about the 3 quotes and you're getting the best price. I tell you, if you show the kind of commitment that you get from having a long-term, multi-site, multi-service agreement with somebody, they don't want to lose that. And that's a different kind of leverage. And it provides a much bigger carrot as you're doing the upfront selection to drive that the value up, and then the promise of keeping it there long term. They don't want to disappoint. So I think having that approach to partnership and working closer with suppliers has got more benefits than the risks.
Yeah, we've had situations where members have introduced a supplier they're using to another member. That's just increased the value of.
Yeah, well, now we're talking about preferred suppliers across multiple organizations, and again, we'll get to that at the end. But collaboration is for sure another piece of this. I wanted to make sure I gave you as many examples as I could. I think I always think about cleaners, snow removal companies as that it's not always about even the cost involved. It's about some of those risks and all the other management stuff that goes into some of those services. So because it's about talking about some of the things that are at stake other than pure price and cost. And it's the cost of your time, the cost of the risk to the organization. So I won't dwell on that any longer. Okay, so what does developing a preferred vendor approach look like? Well, you've all done versions of it, I'm sure. You've got it's essentially the process of going through rigorous supplier selection and document management for each of the vendors that you want to say, okay, you're going to be on our vendor of record list. So you got to do your research. You got to go through a formal selection process. You got to make sure you've got good documentation behind that relationship, both the RP that you put out as well as the contract you sign. All that work is up front, and it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then you've got to be prepared to manage them. So we talk about, okay, how do I make sure they're not getting comfortable? Well, a significant change is your flag. If you see a change in pricing, if you see costs creep up, if you see issues start to emerge, we see a lot of things, times where our preferred vendor will get purchased or there's change in ownership and all of a sudden there's a whole different attitude there. So vendors of record are not forever. They're as long as it's going well and it's as you agreed to in the first place. And again, I want to encourage you to be thinking about long term, so that if you've got any policies that mandate a change in supplier or going to market after, say, 5 years, to rethink that, because that's again counter to some of the principles at play here. So as long as so audit is a good example. So auditors, I don't know, you probably have had your auditors for a long time. You may have got pressure to say, well, we should go to market. It's been 10 years. It's not that simple. Maybe you should go to market if you feel like your audit advice has become stale. You're not really getting the value out of your auditor that you used to. Sure, perhaps it is. If fees have crept up to the point where they're nowhere near what they used to be, another flag. If if the audit staff has changed, you're just not getting the service you used to. But otherwise, I've had so many CFOs who have said, I love my auditor. They do a great job. They now understand us. We understand them. The audit couldn't be more efficient, but I'm told I need to go to market. Frankly, again, I think that's dumb, because what you're doing is putting a lot of people through a lot of work when you essentially know the outcome you want. And I'll tell you, if we do that enough times with enough other vendors out there, they're just going to stop replying to your request for quote or your RFPs. Keep a good thing. I talk to my colleagues in HR a lot of the times, and our work is very similar. You do the work up front to hire a good staff person. You don't go recast the job every 5 years. I think, and there's some coaching involved and there's some working together. Many of the underlying principles, I would say, are very similar. But it also, like with good staff teams, requires good management. And you need to make sure that you're managing issues, you're keeping track of anything, you're not letting anything get out of control. But the first issue doesn't mean you're making a change. The first issue means you're having performance review and coaching and a discussion about how to get it back on track.
Think your current suppliers are giving you the best deal? It's time to put that to the test. As a nonprofit housing provider, making every dollar work harder is essential. With ONPHA Enterprise, your group purchasing program, you can unlock significant savings on phones, office supplies, maintenance services, and more. Try our new invoice value check today. Simply submit a sample of your invoices to onpha.purchasing at rtps.ca by January 31st, and our trusted partners at Roundtable Procurement Services will send you back a snapshot of how much more value you could unlock using ONPHA Enterprise. Plus, by participating, you could win an iPad. Don't wait. Start saving and enter to win today.
There's one that says, in order to have a preferred list of suppliers, do you need to conduct a pre-qualification tender for fairness?
Yeah. So whether it's a pre-qualification tender or it's just a straight up RFP. So if you are looking for a cleaning company to take care of all of your sites, for example, again, pros and cons, and I get it, and everyone's situation is different. But we just did this for one of ONPHA members, one of our clients. And they went from 8 cleaners down to 3, okay? Because just everything's in Toronto, downtown, and frankly, they could probably get to less than 3. But that's a lot of work. That is a lot of work to do that properly, because fairness is a big factor, of course. You've got 8 that are working with you now, and here I am talking about being fair to our vendors, and 5 of them are going to lose their work. Never mind the 55 out there who would like a chance to win it. So absolutely, there's a lot of work up front. If you're saying, look, we're going to establish a vendor record for cleaning services, that's a well-written RFP document that goes out with your cleaning specifications, with site tours. That with those weeks and months of work up front will save you lots of work down the line. But yeah, this is not something that. It's a longer conversation, but it's not something you just anoint someone as your vendor of record. Yeah. To start off with, you might, but I could talk more about that offline if you'd like to, because we can't all do a bunch of large RFPs out of the gate. You've got to start somewhere, and so identifying who your preferred vendors are today, just by the fact that you're using them all the time, might mean that you just have to improve the contract with them or develop a contract with them. But as you move forward and develop the strategy, you have to put in the work up front to make sure you're doing it well, just as you have to put in the work to hire a good staff person.
With the updating of contracts, and then you mentioned rising costs, how do you as the housing member work to develop an agreement to prevent having to pay more as their costs increase? How do you build that?
Yeah, it's a bit specific to the good or service. For many services, you can lock in fixed pricing. Typically, you see some allowed escalation that we try to link to, say, CPI, Consumer Price Index, so that they're allowed to introduce an increase, because again, it's about being fair, both sides, but it can't get out of control. And so, this is why contracts are so important, because if all that is in writing, then you're pretty much covered. But you have to be fair both ways. But as soon as it is getting out of control, that's a flag for you to say, okay, maybe it's time to revisit who our preferred vendor is. So it's a lot of work, and people are sitting here thinking a lot other things to do than running a whole bunch of RFPs to develop a vendor record. There are some shortcuts. Okay, so Hamid, you already mentioned this idea of collaboration. I think we've had a lot of interest and discussion about localized collaboration amongst ONPHA members, especially in the far north, for example. We're saying, okay, we have similar needs, but they're different from those in the Golden Horseshoe. So what can we do? I think working together can really help, because while you may have your list of preferred vendors that you really like and have established, your neighbor might have others that have some good ability to fill your gaps that you've got. And then, the bigger that collaboration gets, the more you cover off your where you're perhaps a little bit lacking. So collaboration is an interesting way to look at it and fast track good knowledge share around who the best vendors are out there.
Yeah, I think it also forces the vendor to be more transparent. Like, we've had situations where we've seen they're pretty close geographically, but the vendor's charging the housing member two different prices. They have two different relationships, but once we combine those relationships, we're able to drive that price down.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'll use and I've talked to some of the groups in membership already about snow removal. Again, I'll use that as an example. Pricing can be all over the map. You might have two properties, two different organizations that are a block away from each other. But again, so combining it makes the price discrepancies more transparent, and you can wipe those out. It also just adds that leverage to say, okay, how good can we do if we work together?
Yeah.
And there's some, I know that you start thinking about the legal issues. You don't have to have one contract that covers both organizations. But if you're working together and talking to the suppliers together, you can have your then individual contracts with them. But it just gives you that much louder voice, that much more power when you're working together. The question about other vendors of record or buying groups, that's certainly another way to sort of all of a sudden have a number of preferred vendors. If you want to leverage the work that some of these buying groups have already done, clearly that's a fast track. And I know, the group we'll talk about in a minute, which is the ONPHA Enterprise Program. All that work that we've talked about has been done to the point where we said, okay, we've got the best of the best selected with the paperwork in place. So that might be attractive to those people who don't want to have to go through all those steps to get there. The one thing, again, I'll emphasize is just be careful of fit for purpose, whether it's the ministry VOR program that you should have access to, or any of these other groups. Know that they were developed for their core audience, and so you're being invited to participate. That's wonderful. Just you then have to be careful that whatever you're having access to fits your needs and not the needs of those it was developed for in the first place. A kind of an example I've seen was joining a preferred vendor, a VOR deal for photocopiers. It was only for the big $10,000 versions that you could get for $9,000. Most of the clients I worked with need something more in the smaller category, which were not under the VOR. So not all needs are the same. And so some solutions are developed for some specific audiences. Okay, so this is where we get to talk a little bit about, we try not to make this sound like a commercial, but the reality is this is why ONPHA developed ONPHA Enterprise. There's a number of things included in it, Enterprise, and again, there's a booth that we encourage you to visit. But at the heart of it, essentially, is a VOR program. It's a preferred vendor program where there are supplier arrangements that have been developed specifically for nonprofit housing for ONPHA members. There are, of course, deals and discounts and all that. But beyond that, it's about the work that has been done to get to the point of confirming that these are good suppliers for this sector. Again, paperwork is in place, and the diligence has been done. And as well, back to your point around, it's a good collaboration. One of the very new suppliers we're just adding, in fact, they couldn't be here this week because they're so new, is a pest control company that came out of the RFP and selection work done by one of the members that we work with. All that work done there, and we said, look, if this is a great pest control company for this housing provider, why can't they be made available to others? So we got to leverage the work because we can't take it all on ourselves. There's too much to do. There's too much redundancy. We can't keep reinventing the wheel in each one of our organizations. So let's learn from each other and let's draw the best of the best to try to use together. It includes a lot more than the vendor of record. There's access to purchasing support for frankly anything you need. It's all free of charge. So if you're having challenges with a contract or with a problem supplier or interpreting one of these regulations or developing your own policy, there's support from myself and our colleagues who do this for a living, for better or worse. This is what we do every day. So if we can help with those of you who don't certainly do this every day, then by all means, we're here to help out. And it does evolve as needs change, as we hear from you and what you want to include. And that's why I go back to this is specifically for ONPHA membership and the housing sector. So we're trying to make sure we have the specific requirements that you need and that the solutions are developed to get you the help that you need to do your good work. I don't know how early we are, but I think that's all I had other than questions.
We have a couple minutes left, but we have some questions that came in. One was saying, could you share examples of alternate policies and bylaws if we don't do a retender every 5 years?
Sure. Yeah, it's really, what you're allowed to write your own rules. It's all those regulations I put up originally aside. You're allowed to write your own rules for your organization. So as long as your board and perhaps you want to get the input from your funder, but as long as you're comfortable with the way you write your policy, it is yours. It is yours to write. One of the lessons that came out of my work with the Ministry of Finance when we were putting the original directive together was they admitted, look, we just want people to look at this. We just want management to be aware. We want good decisions to be made. We actually care less about what those decisions are. Not entirely true, but really what they wanted to do was that every decision was made consciously rather than someone just deciding to go and sign a landscaping agreement for thousands of dollars where they shouldn't be. So visibility is key. What rules you set up for your own organization is frankly up to you and your organization. Keep in mind that you've got to roll in these best practices.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend, 20-year agreements that allow you to not get out no matter what. That's not what I'm saying either. But changing every 5 years, you just don't include that requirement in your policy was one of the things I would suggest.
But I'd be curious what the remaining audience, how many people have taken a look at ONPHA Enterprise? I say within the last year. It's okay if you haven't, but just curious if you raise your hands. All right, we go.
Okay,
we go on.
Oh, good. No, and it's good that this is new information for you, because we need to make sure people are aware. It doesn't do much good if it's sitting there not being used. I guess that's the other thing I better say. The more we use some of these supplier deals, of course, the better they get. And some of them you'll see at the trade show tomorrow are identified as enterprise preferred vendors. We've got some that are in the room here. In fact, last year we went to RFP specifically for end of mortgage advisory services. If you may have seen those messages, but Hairco, who's one of the advisors selected, is here. So again, those are arrangements done as a direct result of an RFP run just for this membership and specifically for end of mortgage. So that's just one good example, and they're in the room today.
I think the one, I know you mentioned it earlier about how the program continues to grow organically is through partnerships that our members have with their local suppliers too.
Yeah. And
removing the fear of introducing them to ONPHA or the ONPHA enterprise doesn't necessarily mean that their relationship is going to change in any way. It only gets stronger, and the program can grow, and more people from our sector can use it.
Well, absolutely, yeah. In fact, if you've got a good supplier that you love, share the wealth. And I think rather than that being a risk to your relationship, it tends to be good news for the supplier that they have the opportunity to have more work in the housing sector. And one of the things we look for is who's legitimately interested in supporting the sector. And so if they want to expand their horizon a little bit, typically that's a good thing. This pest control relationship we just mentioned, one organization won the work. At the opportunity to become preferred vendor for the enterprise program, they got even more aggressive with pricing and increased value being added because of the larger audience. So yeah, if you've got a good vendor that you like and believe could help other housing providers, please let us know, and we'll talk to them about getting included.
All right. Well, I want to thank David for today, also in the audience as well. But have a great day, everyone, and thank you for tuning in.
Think your current suppliers are giving you the best deal? It's time to put that to the test. As a nonprofit housing provider, making every dollar work harder is essential. With ONPHA Enterprise, your group purchasing program, you can unlock significant savings on phones, office supplies, maintenance services, and more. Try our new invoice value check today. Simply submit a sample of your invoices to onpha.purchasing at rtps.ca by January 31st, and our trusted partners at Roundtable Procurement Services will send you back a snapshot of how much more value you could unlock using ONPHA Enterprise. Plus, by participating, you could win an iPad. Don't wait! Start saving and enter to win today.